Well, while we've heard some of the background to the Reserve Bank review from the Treasurer today, along with new information that a Treasury report looking at its woeful track record of forecasting commodity prices might give the budget a boost. So let's bring in here Richard Yetsenga, the Chief Economist at the ANZ Bank. Richard, always good to chat to you on the program here. Let's start with this RBA review, shall we? Why would it be that the government needs legislation to change the function of the Reserve Bank? Do you sense that this might be about splitting the functions of the Reserve Bank that requires that?
Look, it's possible. I mean, the government's talked about two sets of changes. One that I guess requires parliamentary approval through legislation, and the other one that they can do without parliamentary approval. And the Treasurer has been clear in flagging that the review would consider both types of changes, and the Treasurer has given us a few hints as time's gone on, and it does seem like there'll be both types of changes involved. Certainly it's good to have a real look at every policy institution, I think, and the Reserve Bank review seems like it's been very thorough.
OK, so there's some aspects to this that are interesting. One would be the composition of the board. That's been flagged out there for quite some time. Number two is the way in which interest rates are set, whether there needs to be a separate monetary policy committee like there are in other parts of the world, and then a separate board at the Reserve Bank that effectively goes and runs the functions of the bank. Do you sense that that would be world's best practice for Australia right now?
Look, I think world's best practice is getting the right outcomes and being confident that you have the right setup for whatever economy you're talking about. There are a range of countries that run setups of the type you talk about, where the management issues, if you like, are separate from the policy issues. I certainly can see some advantages in that, but I think, like any CEO of any company, the two things are ultimately related. Management of the company, the intellect you need, the type of challenge that you have internally obviously also affects the sort of advice and ultimately the output you can provide. Some separation is good. I think it'll be finely balanced as to whether people think it's a step forward or not.
OK, so the Reserve Bank has become the first of the major central banks around the Western world to keep interest rates on hold. Now, it's not to say that others won't do it in the future, but given the fact that the jobs market remains so strong, and you saw even over the weekend that the property markets, we'll talk about those later, have also had a very strong performance, is there a chance the Reserve Bank might be embarrassed by this pause to those interest rates if the economy simply just keeps on rolling along?
I don't think embarrassed is the right term. Certainly 6 months ago, when the bank moved from 50-point hikes to 25, the word that popped into my head was brave. And when they paused this month as well, that's the word that also popped into my head, given the strength in the labour market, given the strength in the housing sector. By the same token, this is really about balancing a whole lot of different objectives. Ideally, what we have is a monetary policy tightening cycle that does squeeze inflation out of the system, as hurtful as that is to some parts of the community, but also sustains the gains in the labour market we've had the last couple of years, and particularly around women's employment. We've really hit some great milestones around their participation in the labour force, share of full-time employment, the fall in the part-time share of the workforce. I think all of these things would be great to hang on to. If pausing for a month or a couple can help the bank get some balance around that, I think that's a good process.
OK, I want to go to another point that Ed Boyd just mentioned here, and that is forecasts about the Australian dollar. And there are strong forecasts that the Australian dollar will fall, largely because our interest rates are lower than interest rates are at comparable countries around the world. But when you have a lower dollar, it brings inflation in, because you effectively import that inflation because the imported goods prices are much higher.
Look, I agree. Certainly, if where you're getting to is that a lower currency is not the route to sustainable prosperity, I absolutely agree with that. It's not that you want the currency strengthening out of all regard for the fundamentals, but certainly weaker is not better, particularly when it reflects poor fundamentals. I think the reality is Australia can run interest rates below other countries now, because Australia now runs a meaningful current account surplus. The days when a small negative interest rate differential were poison for the currency was a world in which the current account deficit was quite large. That's not where we are. I actually think the currency is going to strengthen this year. I think we've got another 10% higher before this cyclical up move in the Aussie dollar is finished.
It's going to be interesting. Just one last thing, because it's about commodity prices, and we talked about Treasury not getting those forecasts right. Just very briefly, do you get a sense that you're better to be below the forecast or above in that case?
Well, as one professional forecaster to another, I'm not going to criticise Treasury about its commodity price forecast, that's for sure. I certainly think a budget's meant to have some conservatism in it. The reality has been Treasury has undercooked the commodity price forecast. I'm not sure that we should be blaming them for undercooking forecasts. If it helps them make more conservative and more sustainable decisions, I think that's probably a reasonable price to pay.